But really, the only job that I've got today is to say thank you all very, very much for being part of this great community over the last year. This is our last piece of the Prez prior to the holiday break. And I think that this has just been such an incredibly exciting year for this community. We have seen over the last 10 years, organizations like ourselves and Velocity work so hard to build a world-class ecosystem that makes this the best place to start and grow a technology company on the planet. And we've seen great companies start to build out a really robust and exciting funnel. You know, if you come into Velocity and you see the incredible companies, you come up onto the third floor at Communitech, take a look at the growth firms that are going to pop in the next 5 to 10 years. We're on the cusp of greatness. We're on the cusp of seeing the kind of activity and impact and growth and scaling firms and acquisitions that we have not seen since the late 90s. And I think that as we look back over time, we're going to look at 2018 and say, that was the turning point for this community. That was the year when all of the hard work that we've all put into starting and growing companies and supporting the ecosystem has started to bear fruit. And so I think that 2019 is going to be an extraordinary year for our community. I think it's going to be an exciting time for the companies as they, sort of hit the next level and hit their stride. And the best is yet to come. And speaking about the best is yet to come, Irrepressible, he's called often, or not often, but occasionally. Rarely he's called Irrepressible. I have the good fortune of being able to work with Jay Shah in a whole bunch of different ways. I first met him when he was younger than he is now, which is really kind of not very accurate, but it is. And he was at the time just finishing up a mechatronics program, and he was launching a company called Bufferbox along with a couple of other people. And meeting Jay was one of those moments where you just know that this person is extraordinary. And from that day, I've always enjoyed the opportunity of working with him and spending time with him. He's also on the board of directors of Communitech, in which he brings, his passion and understanding of this community and how to build great companies. And he's also a friend. And I think that the thing that's about Jay that's so remarkable is that not only is he one of the smartest people I've ever met, but he's also one of the nicest people I've ever met. This is not your eulogy. Please join me in welcoming Jay Shah.
Yourself and everyone else in this ecosystem. And what I wanted to do today was share just some thoughts about everything I've observed over the last couple of years in my various different roles, synthesize that into some conversations around sound bites that I think we hear often. Certainly I hear them, and I think you will as well. And how some of those sound bites can be unhelpful, they can be misinterpreted, and you need to go into more depth and context so that we have these substantive conversations instead of going to the extremes and deciding one thing or another just based on little snippets. So that's going to be the framing for the conversation. I hope everyone takes something out of it. But before I get into that, everybody's opinions come from their set of lived experiences. So I want to share a little bit about my background so you know what lived experiences are informing all the things I'm about to say next, because you're probably not going to agree with everything I have to say, and that's totally fine. And I encourage you to tell me that too, because I think it'd be really hardy to have that debate. But at least you know where I'm coming from. You know what experiences I've had that have informed the things I'm about to say. So as Ian mentioned, came to the Waterloo region from Toronto as an aspiring engineer. Really wanted to become a controls engineer. Automation was my jam. I thought I was going to work in a manufacturing plant, make it more efficient through the mechatronics program. But it turned out that that was a little boring. And I discovered that through some co-op terms, and had the benefit of working at a couple different startups that exposed me to these really high-performance small teams that I fell in love with. So after a couple co-op terms with those small teams, the idea started to build inside me that maybe I should work with classmates and other people on campus to attempt to build something of my own in this really small, high-powered team. And so fast forward through to kind of third and fourth year, ideating with various team members, various classmates, coming up with this idea of Bufferbox, which was these asynchronous lockers for parcel delivery. We built this really rickety prototype for our fourth year design project. Super dangerous, it was kind of rusty, you wouldn't have really wanted to use it. But it proved the point that you could build a locker that you could put a package in and press a code in, and your package would come. So you wouldn't have to go to the post office anymore if you had a delivery to your house and you weren't home. So from Capstone to the Accelerator Center is actually where we went first because we didn't know where to go. Actually, before that, there's really no logo there. We just kind of camped out on the university campus. We didn't know where to go, and so we found an office that we had like the door code to. It was a summer term. Nobody was using it. We put some newspaper on the windows, and we just used this office. And we hoped that the office neighbors didn't really know what was going on in there. But eventually, we got a little bit more legit. We moved into the Accelerator Center. We were there for a little bit. We became Communitech members somewhere in that journey. And then when the Velocity Garage opened in its kind of current configuration-ish, we joined it. And you'll notice the old logo there because that is what the logo was when Bufferbox joined Velocity. But we started to build our company there. We really started to figure out what we were doing from this scrappy metal box that, like I said, you wouldn't have wanted to touch because it might have hurt you, to a product that you could actually put out in the field, a product that people would use. And through that journey, we ended up applying to Y Combinator on a whim. There's a longer story there, but to our surprise, we got accepted. We moved the team down for the 3 months. Actually, did a lot of back and forth since our physical operations were here. And the momentum in the roller coaster ride really started to pick up and accelerate. And so after that, we came back here. We continued to build a business. We continued to scale to the degree that we could with the funding we had. And we ended up with this fork in the road of continue to build the business, raise more capital. We were a pretty physically intensive business in terms of building physical product and having to deploy infrastructure. Or through a whole bunch of interesting serendipity, luck, and connections, we had a different path on the fork in the road, which was an acquisition to Google. And that is what ended up happening. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So in terms of timeline, from the time we graduated to the time we were acquired was about 18 months. And I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. While I was at Google, wanted to stay involved in the community. It's hard to do that. Google's a bit of a fortress because everything that people work on there is kept confidential. But my way to do that was by making angel investments in the community, being a limited partner in a couple seed stage funds, which gave me a lens into the other side of the startup world. And then 3.5 years in, on a 4-year vesting schedule, I left Google to join Velocity. And the reason I did that was because I thought that was the best place I could have impact on the startup ecosystem here, bring the experiences of kind of the Bufferbox world and the Google world of big tech to the entrepreneurs today that are building really ambitious businesses. So that's the background that informs what I'm going to talk about next. Okay, so I think I built this up already, but sound bites aren't helpful. I think more and more so, conversations tend to get distilled into sound bites. We see this in the news for sure, but I think we see it in every aspect of communication. And they're really tempting to say things like, Canadian startups sell too early, or Canadian VCs suck. But there's a lot of depth to those statements that need to be explored. Maybe there's some truths in all sides, but let's actually dig into some of those things so we don't get tempted by these really broad stroke statements. The first one that I wanted to talk about revolves around what it takes to build a startup, the amount of effort required, work-life balance in that conversation. So on one side of the sound bites, you have, and I'm going to tell some of these stories through tweets because, those are short, unhelpful sound bites. So on one side of the equation, you've got some of these stories or some of these comments, like no one can change the world in 40 hours a week, Elon Musk. Or Paul Graham saying that he's noticed a pattern, people work really long in the early stages. And this is true. I think there's elements of this conversation that are 100% true. But the other side of that is we can go too far, right? And there's this concept of hustle porn. Alexis Ohanian, I think, coined this at a conference recently, or there was at least a lot of conversation around this. And this is 100% true as well. Like, you don't want to celebrate sheer effort just based on volume. Just because you work 100 hours a week doesn't mean you're going to be a successful entrepreneur. So I feel like this should be dissected. Another part of this, too, is who are these messages going to? Because that changes how they should be absorbed by various people. So the first point I want to make, there's no value in taking pride in just the sheer volume of work. Working 60 hours, 70 hours, 100 hours doesn't really matter. But building a startup that matters is going to take everything that you have, right? So I think the messaging to entrepreneurs and founders to say that you can build a startup and truly have full balance is misguided. Ambitious goals require sacrifice. Ambitious goals require you to go above and beyond. If not, everyone could or would try and do this. Some people might be able to do this more without sheer brute force through experience. But even those people, I think, apply brute force on top of their experience for that multiple of effort. On this side of the kind of hustle porn argument, you're no good to anybody, like yourself or anyone around you. You're no good to execute your own vision if you're not physically or mentally well, right? So you need to take care of yourself 100%, whatever that means to you, whether that's your network of peers, your support structure. But you need to do that in the context that you have chosen as an entrepreneur, if you're an entrepreneur in the room, you've chosen a path that's going to be freaking brutal, right? That was your choice to take that ambitious path. That's awesome, but it's unlikely that you can have everything both ways, right? Ambition's going to come with some amount of sacrifice. And then talking about the audiences and segmentation. So if you look up that Elon tweet and you scroll through some of the responses, maybe don't do that. Don't read the comments on the internet. Someone told me. But if you do that, you see a lot of people responding with counterpoints saying, no, like I changed the world and I don't work 100 hours a week. I'm not a sociopath that wants all my employees to work 100 hours a week. That's true, but it depends on where you are in your company, right? If I use the analogy like building a fire, if you're a startup, you're literally rubbing two pieces of wood together to try and get this thing to ignite, right? It's sheer hustle. It's a mad dash to go, right? Once it's lit, okay, you can probably step back a little bit, and it's a little bit easier to build that by adding components as you go. It's less mad dash, right? And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got big corporates that are more like a combustion engine, right? Completely controlled burn, got lots of components on this engine that are making it run, departments, cogs in the wheel, however you want to talk about it. And these messages can be heard by very different people in very different ways, right? So if you're an entrepreneur or startup founder, I wouldn't take this as the path forward, that you don't need to work really, really, really hard to make your ambitions possible. Again, in the context that you need to take care of yourself. And if you're working in an innovative large business, I wouldn't take this to mean the other side, to mean that you need to be working 70, 80 hours a week inside a large corporate machine. So there's balance on both sides of this. Okay, the other point that I wanted to make is that Canadian startups sell too early. This is a soundbite that we hear often. I figured I would just talk about this one because of the timeline of my own startup, that we went from graduation to acquisition in 18 months. And I often get asked when talking about the BufferBox story, was it the right choice to get acquired, right? Was that, like, in hindsight, would you do it again? Do you regret that? Various variants of this question. They just go for the heart. And generally speaking, my answer is, for us to have realized the vision that we wanted, that we set forward, it was not the right path for us to take. In hindsight, that's really easy for me to say, okay? With the benefit of the acquisition, with obvious financial upside that comes with that, it's easy for me to say that, but I still believe, factoring everything I know now, the value of attempting to realize the vision we had set out would have been greater than the proceeds of the acquisition. And at the time, when we were at that fork in the road of raise more capital or proceed with this acquisition offer that had materialized, we had a lot of people telling us that. We had partners from YC telling us that. We had mentors here telling us that. And we did not synthesize what they were saying. We took it for granted that this path that we had was something we could replicate again, or that it was something that was relatively common. Because we're living in our little startup bubble. We were so heads down. So this is one of the messages I want to say, that as somebody who's been through that cycle, who's had the opportunity, the good fortune to have an acquisition offer to consider, I think it's really important to think incredibly deeply about what's valuable to you. The attempt to realize your vision and have total control over realizing that vision, or the amplification through an acquirer to realize that vision, and whether that's real or not, right? Knowing what I know now, I would probably ask very different questions going through the acquisition process about what would happen to our baby once it was integrated. I refer to the first year as acquisition indigestion for my time at Google. The reason that came as a surprise, all of the hiccups, the missteps, the frustration, what felt like banging our head against a wall trying to continue to build a startup inside, at the time, a 50,000 person tech company, was that we hadn't asked the right questions going into it. We hadn't asked what would happen to autonomy. We hadn't asked what was incentivizing investment in this product. So, do Canadian startups sell too early? Maybe sometimes they do, maybe they don't. You, as a founder, you shouldn't take any, you shouldn't feel bad about considering this option, right? It's your prerogative, it's an incredibly personal decision. If you're ever presented with this case and you're having trouble, let me know. I'm gonna try and convince you otherwise. But the other side of this is that we need more early stage risk capital in the system, right? We're as Ian said, we're an ecosystem that's been building its strength for years. But without exits and without liquidity, you can't build an ecosystem that has high risk capital. And the only way you get that is through liquidity and exits, right? So we need those exits to be able to support this high risk capital. That's where angel investors come in. That's where seed stage high risk capital comes from for the most part. This isn't institutional VC, billions of dollars. This is people, entrepreneurs, former entrepreneurs on the ground who have capital to throw at high risk projects. So I think there's this loop that we need to be aware of. So that soundbite, the Canadian startups sell too early, is the exact opposite side of the coin of we don't have enough capital in Canada. It's like, how do you balance those two things? We need to cultivate both. And over time, our ability to hold on to companies through scale, build them bigger, will increase because we'll have a foundation that gets bigger and stronger and bigger and stronger, capital being one of the components. And the last point I'll make on this is that none of this happens overnight, right? Like this is decades in the making as an ecosystem where capital feeds ambition and the ability to fund startups through later and later stages. Okay, another soundbite. This one I'll get in trouble for. So if you read, I'm gonna read this one out. So this is Paul Graham, founder of Y Combinator. I met someone who works at a government-created startup incubator consisting of office space. I imitated the way the inevitable VIPs would walk through on the inevitable tours, and he asked me, astonished, how did I know that would happen? And then someone responded, beware of the startup petting zoo, which is a term I've also used. And there's some truth to this. We do have to beware of the startup petting zoo. We have to beware of what the ecosystem brings to entrepreneurs and what the entrepreneurs do with what comes from incubators, accelerators, and the support structures that we have. But I would challenge everyone here to think about why does the support system exist to begin with, right? And the support system's intent is to rally resources to the cause of entrepreneurs and innovators. That, to me, is the underlying intent. And by definition, as an entrepreneur or an innovator, you need to be super, super resourceful. So you have the system that's rallying resources to your cause, but you're the only person as that entrepreneur or innovator who can take those resources and turn them into something. That's your responsibility, right? I've met entrepreneurs, self-described entrepreneurs, who might get into a program. They might get into Velocity, as an example, and start exuding this defined success of, I got into Velocity, so I must be successful. It's like, no, that isn't building a company, right? That's not an end game. Velocity's purpose, in this case, if I use that analogy, is really just to rally resources to the entrepreneur's cause. And the entrepreneur has to make the most of those resources, right? So when thinking about this ecosystem, when thinking about sound bites that might say, government incubators are startup petting zoo, to take this for a most extreme interpretation, just take a step back and realize what those systems are doing. They're rallying resources to your cause so you can make the most of them, but you have to control your own destiny by using those resources, right? On the other side of this type of conversation is the ecosystem itself, and I think there's many people in the room here that are in that ecosystem of rallying resources to entrepreneurs and innovators. We need to stay focused, and we need to constantly review what we do and challenge ourselves to only do what we can be really, really helpful with, right? I'm guilty of this for sure in Velocity, and we've asked ourselves this downstairs quite a bit of, do we try and help where we're not equipped to do so? Because if we're doing that, we're not helping entrepreneurs, right? And so I think if the ecosystem keeps this in mind, that we can't be everything for everybody, we can't, the point of having a system is that eventually you have entrepreneurs that outgrow the support system because they're so good that we don't know who can help them from our support system. And then eventually they'll be the people that are the next layer of support in the stack that we build over time. So it's weird to see things like this that maybe throw the incubation system or the accelerator system or the support structures. They throw them away with a bunch of cynicism, saying they might not be worth it, or they're a bunch of tours, or it's a bunch of hype. Sure, maybe, but it's the only way to rally resources to the cause and to be able to create that focus and attention for entrepreneurs. Okay, the other one that I hear quite a bit from entrepreneurs, and particularly ambitious entrepreneurs, is that they're tired of the Canadian VC system, they've given up on Canadian VCs, or it's US money or bust. Like many things, when I hear these, I think that treating any large group as a monolith is super dangerous. It's convenient, it's an oversimplified view, and it might even just be a justification that fundraising, or because fundraising is so hard, this is a nice excuse. That the Canadian VC system isn't very good. But there's some context to some of these statements, right? So if you look at Canadian funds, you look at Canadian VC, they don't have long histories yet relative to their US peers. Many Canadian funds are on their first, second, third fund. VCs, in large part, started in the US. You have funds there that might be on their 10th fund or more. And that actually means that Canadian funds have more in common with a startup than a US fund, because they have something to prove to the limited partners, the people that fund them. They don't have that several decades of history to say, fund 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, 8 all have positive return, 30% IRR, because those funds don't exist in the Canadian ecosystem. So if you're looking to partner with a VC, which should be a partnership, it's not just money, they should be helping you scale your business, ask yourself, who's more likely to help you get through all the big challenges? The VC that has something to prove existentially so that they can raise their second or third fund, or a VC that's been around for a really long time that may not still have that hunger in them. The other thing to think about is tactically, who can be helpful, right? It's really hard for VCs that are far away to engage deeply and meaningfully on an ongoing basis. Distance is hard, especially when you're dealing with challenges that just require human-to-human interaction, right? And typically the VCs, or your investors and your founders, are dealing with a lot of those, whether it's recruitment, trying to build a brand, inter-portfolio connections. And so that needs to be part of the equation when you're thinking about what types of investors to raise from. And these are kind of the nuances that often get undervalued against valuations, right? So the Canadian system, Canadian VCs, it's probably fair to say, are more valuation sensitive than your average US VC, if we're just treating them in two average buckets. But there's a cost to that, right? Raising only in the context of high valuations can be really dangerous. We've seen down rounds before. We've seen it really hard to be able to raise the second or third round after an inflated valuation, or what would be perceived as an inflated valuation after the fact. And so I would encourage everyone to think really deeply about who's really hungry when it comes to your investors, who can help get behind your business, really help you through some of the tough times, be almost a hands-on supporter without being a meddler. And who actually has the capacity to do that. So my summary line here is, don't write off the Canadian investors, set the right filters so you know who you can talk to and who you can't, because in every ecosystem you're going to have people that may not be worth talking to, and that a mix is probably the best balance, and I'll talk a little bit more on the next slide. Okay, I love Canada, I love the Canadian ecosystem, I love our value system, what we believe in, what we stand for, but from an economic perspective, especially for startups, scale-ups, and innovators, the Canadian market, the Canadian domestic market, is really, really small. I think we hear that a lot, right? 10th of the size, however you want to measure it. It's not a really good way to build a business that can be massive, or have a foundation to be massive on the global scale. I still see lots of entrepreneurs who size up the Canadian market. Even though there's a lot of conversation around exports, going global, and it's confusing to me, because if you're taking this really, really hard path, you've chosen to take this really ambitious path to build a company, why would you fight for a small prize? right? Like what's the point of doing that, right? Thinking global, right? As early as you can, thinking about massive markets is super important. I think some of this is out of convenience, out of familiarity. It's the closest thing to us. Some of it, I think, is an expression of patriotism and just really wanting your product to be used in the country that you built it in. But I would argue that it's actually more beneficial for our country to have massive global winners than it is to have everyone in the country adopt, because our domestic market is so small. There's something else that we don't talk about on this front about the Canadian market that it's difficult to talk about, because I don't think we see it in our bubble of startups and innovation and entrepreneurship in this building, in the tannery, with so many people who are oriented towards adopting technologies and being competitive globally. And you've probably all seen this, the adoption curve, the various stages of the adoption curve. And I think we have a Canadian shift on this curve. I think the Canadian adoption curve is skewed. And the good news is, the skew doesn't really matter at the early stage, in the innovators and to some degree in the early adopters, which means as a startup, using the Canadian ecosystem to get those first customers, to get the early adopters, is not a disadvantage. They exist, large part to the same degree they might in other places where the curve doesn't have the shift on it. But in addition to the fact that we have a really small market, we also have a market that is generally slower at adopting technologies. There's a lot of ways you can measure this. There's reports on tech diffusion in the country. There's reports on how much Canadian companies spend on software tools per worker versus US, and there's a huge gap there. There's lots of ways you can measure this as an economist. The point is, as a country, we're not early adopters, right? We skew the other way. So in addition to the size and the scale, we have this problem where it's going to take you a lot longer even to get saturation in the Canadian market. So it's just one more reason that we really should be focused on going global. Go to places that have big markets and that have more, whose bigger markets are more conducive to adopting early. And that's my message for the entrepreneurs in the room, the people building startups and scale-ups. On the other side, for people who are working at larger enterprises and corporations, it's your job to move your corporations to the left. You have to be the champions inside your organizations that change how people see adopting innovation. It's hard. It's super painful. This might sound weird, but I feel like I experienced some of that at Google, just trying to change mindset and get people to move quickly. I think that's true of any large business, regardless of whether you're in tech or not. And so I think it's great that we have corporate innovation initiatives, because we've got to move this, right? It's national economic importance that we move this damn curve over to the left. Otherwise, a bunch of the established businesses are going to be left behind because they're not adopting technologies that are necessary to keep them relevant in the future. Okay, I had an action item for all the entrepreneurs and startups here and all the people in corporates. So I'm going to follow up with you on that somehow. So I wanted to kind of conclude here a little bit and then open up for questions on why does any of this really matter? And some of this ties into just like my personal reason for doing what I do at Velocity, and why I love what I do at Velocity as well. The things that we hold dear about Canada aren't possible without a strong economy. Whatever that is that you hold dear, the values, the global influence, and none of that's going to be possible if our economy isn't powered by globally competitive startups, scale-ups, innovative companies. Whether they be homegrown or not, that's a different debate. But this is really, really important. And I think everybody in this room has a part to play in that. And it's like national importance. Like, I mean that. I'm not just saying that because I live and breathe in the tannery. But I think if you're a startup or a scale-up, you've got to go global and become that massive dominating player in Canada. If you're an established business, you've got to be more competitive and start adopting tech earlier so you can be more competitive on the global scale. Shameless plug. We have an incubator downstairs. We can help you do some of this if you're a startup or an entrepreneur. Let me know, or someone from Velocity. But yeah, that's why I do what I do. That's why I'm really passionate about making sure we're all focused on building massive things of global importance. And I'll end it there on the soundbite crushes. But yeah, I'll open up for questions if that's what we do. Is that what we do next? Questions? Maybe? Ian's nodding. We do questions. Okay. Great. Thanks.
We do have the magic cube for those of you who would like to ask questions, because we are live streaming. Yes?
Thanks for that, Jay. So you said you moved from Toronto to UW or Waterloo for UW first, and then what made you stick around here? Like, even after your exit, you had the option to go to Toronto or the Valley.
Yeah.
What made you stick here?
No, okay, so yeah, just that's on that'll be on the live stream. I don't have to repeat the question, right? Yeah. Okay. Great. The honest, like, not super interesting answer is that it was probably out of convenience, because we were running with this project turned into startup. It was just easier to stay where we were. If I dig deeper into that though, like, at the time, that would have been the answer, right? Like, I don't know anything else that's going on. I'm just focused on the project. But if I think about what would have happened if we had tried to move, it would have been so different in a negative way. We didn't have the support system around us. We didn't have the people around us who could coach us. We didn't have the spaces, the flexibility, the network. So the rest of the journey that I talked about that unfolded, none of that would have been possible had we done that. I don't think we recognized any of that at the time. We just kind of staying put. We got lucky that was the right decision. Yeah. So that's the honest answer. But like I said, I think the support system here was critical to being able to get off the ground, challenging some of our early assumptions, forcing us to places we might not have gone otherwise if we just left to our own devices. And the network here, it's unparalleled, right? Like, the people's willingness to help, go out of their way to be part of your journey in a positive way, give you feedback, give you support. It's really significant. Well, while we're getting the mic over there, I'm just going to tell a fun anecdote about this. So I mentioned we were at the Accelerator Center for a little bit, and we didn't understand, like, what's Communitech, what's the Accelerator Center, like, what's the university. We didn't know any of these differences. In large part, some of that doesn't matter. But we got invited to this event, Breakfast Tech 5 or something like that. It was 7 a.m. in the morning, and I remember we got the invite from someone at the Accelerator Center, but the event was a Communitech event, because everyone's working together, doing great things. And it was like early stages, but the event was booked out months in advance. It was coming closer, and we were like, oh, what this is bullshit, like a 7 a.m. thing that we have to show up for and give like a 3-minute pitch. This sounds terrible. But doing that, the person after the little talk that I gave that came up to me was Steve Woods from Google, director of the Google site here, or engineering in Canada, handed me his business card and was like, we should talk. And it was like an oh shit moment of like, what just happened? Like, we're building metal boxes, like, we barely have product, like, who is this guy that just gave us this business card that runs this massive tech company? And then that unfolded into like a pilot deployment on the site here. So like that moment just wouldn't have happened without the community of things that came together, right? That wasn't pure luck, that was architected luck.
Right? Reflecting on, if I knew then what I know now, what are the 3 that haunt you most?
Oof, this is recorded too, delightful. The 3 that haunt me the most. So I think I already said one, right? Like, to realize our vision, we shouldn't have been acquired, right? Like, we should have taken the path of attempting to raise more funding and building the vision under our own control and destiny. 100% acknowledge that could have ended up as a total failure. But I think, again, the value of doing that would have been worth more than any financial upside we got through the acquisition. Easy for me to say now, but I truly believe that. I think we spent a lot of time in the trenches working on our business. So going to that point of like hustle porn and 100-hour weeks, it wasn't uncommon for our founding team to be working in some, I don't know what the hours would have been, but some ludicrous amount of hours. If I think back to some of those moments, I don't think we were very productive. Like, we were just flooring it because we thought that's what we needed to do. But if we had taken a step back just to settle, to be a little bit more thoughtful about the work we were doing, we probably would have been more efficient about how we got things done, which who knows what that would have opened up us to in terms of other opportunities. Like, I don't know what the opportunity cost of all of that unproductive hustle was. I remember, peanut butter jar on my desk that was half open all the time because that that's just food, right? Like, don't need time for lunch. And that's not helpful, right? I think we could have done better and accomplished more had we just been a little bit more thoughtful. I don't know if I can come up with a third right now. I mean, I think probably not acknowledging the power of global networks. Like we had quite a debate about whether we should even apply to YC, and I don't know why that would really be, why we should have debated that even before considering putting an application in. Not to over-index on YC, but like just as a way to get exposed to a global network. And that might be more personal. I think the rest of our team was more balanced, but I just had like a chip on my shoulder that we don't need them, like just do it all ourselves. But that's a good way to build a Canadian business. So, yeah.
Jay, thanks for acknowledging that half the battle in raising venture capital is from Canadian investors is contextual and understanding where they're coming from. What is your hope today for the venture capital landscape in Canada and fundraising as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, so there's been reports, NACO and others that have shown more Canadian venture capital is flowing than probably any period in time since we've been monitoring this. That's awesome. We still have a very long way to go from total capital pools being available to match the ambition and demand that we have. Certainly anecdotally, if I look at the portfolio and velocity, we're still raising a lot more money outside of Canada than we are from in. I think my hope is that founders here recognize and entrepreneurs recognize that Canadian VCs have a positive role to play in building your businesses. Having a mix in the portfolio is helpful, so you still have global exposure. Like having a VC that's not based in your home country is probably helpful to expand your network. But having a bunch of really big winners in this region in the corridor that have zero Canadian investors would be like a failure on both parts, both the entrepreneur and the VC community. And so I think that acknowledgement kind of needs to happen where VCs are willing to go the extra mile, whether that's through being helpful, not necessarily just saying, yeah, we'll take any valuation, it doesn't matter. That might not be practical for Canadian VC economics, but I think that's where we need to get to. So I see positive signs of that. So if you ask where we're going, I think we're going there. We need to have conversations that go into a little bit more depth, and I think it's dangerous if we have entrepreneurs who just write off the whole system and then tell other aspiring entrepreneurs to write off the whole system. So we might be at a fork in the road where we need to make sure we don't go down the dark path.
Jay, I have a question for you. Why Corridor Demo Day? And why New York City?
Ooh, well, yeah, this is great. This is like a leading question. I love it. So Corridor Demo Day. Okay, so power. Somebody asked why Waterloo, right? Corridor Demo Day is a great showcase of the power of the community, right? So years and years of people building up support systems, rallying resources to innovators and entrepreneurs' cause. And 2017, we find ourselves with, I'm making up a directional number just to exaggerate, but like 15 different demo days in the region, right? We've got like Rev and Velocity and a whole bunch of other programs. And it just seemed like we were now creating noise and fighting against ourselves, right? So this simple conversation of, hey, everybody in the ecosystem, why don't we like kill a bunch of demo days, rally our resources behind one focused effort around raising investment, let's try and do this. And in a span of like 6 or 8 weeks, community rallies together and says, yeah, let's do it. Let's like just start rearranging things on the fly. We're changing parts on this moving train as we go because we think it'll benefit the region. I don't think that could happen in many other places. This is a pretty remarkable place. So I think that was 2017. We did the first one. Why? To create focus, to create deal flow, to get investors exposed to what's going on here, to create a higher bar and a higher standard for entrepreneurs to say, if you're not investment worthy to raise the capital you need, we're going to tell you that. It may not be what you want to hear, but you need to, because you're going to spin your cycles or spin your wheels trying to raise when we're like 99% certain this isn't going to go well, and you should probably focus on building business substance anyway before raising. So we're on the third one. It's in New York at the end of January. The second one, or the previous one was right here. We're going to kind of rotate it, West Coast, East Coast, back somewhere in the corridor. It should be great. I mean, the point is investors and deal flow and capital. And one day we won't need to send all our companies away to accelerators because we'll have all the capital we need.
One final question.
Hey Jay, I think that was a good speech. I like the. I think I had a question about how you framed that corporate companies should be adopting more innovative, kind of working with startups earlier. So I don't know if you have the answer for this, but having worked with and at some of like banks and, you know, with these large companies, there's like a fundamental reluctance almost to like work with these companies. So it seems like overall the image that they're saying is like, you know, we innovate, we want to use these we want to use these products, whatever. But then when it comes to actually getting to the point of integrating it into your workflow, you know, IBM is still winning, like they're still using these old outdated technologies. And so even though the initial part is there to start using them, it seems like it kind of dies off once it actually becomes a real thing. How do you propose they actually adopt this? Because it seems to be that management is kind of where it's starting to dies off.
Yeah. Well, so I think maybe a good place to start on answering that is like people cause change, right? Like I don't think directives cause change, especially in massive organizations, right? It's going to be an army of people that are fighting for a particular type of outcome to make something possible. If that's adopting early tech or taking more risk, right? So I don't think, you know, me or a government program or somebody saying thou shalt innovate and be an early adopter, that's not going to make any difference. But I think inspiring individuals who have decision-making authority or who can be internal champions to say we will not be as competitive if we don't do this is really important. I think competitive complacency is probably the larger issue that we need to tackle. If like in the context of this curve, there's a lot of big Canadian companies that are very successful, who are successful in the country, and then just stop at the border. They're just like, yeah, I'm done now. Like, we dominated Canada, we're good. Like our telcos are a great example of this, right? Like we have some really great telecommunications companies. None of them operate outside of Canada. That's really weird, right? They had the capital to do so. They could have, right? And so I think we need to change that culture. But I think it's by impressing upon people the point that this is of national importance for us to have global winners that are expanding into global markets, and the only way to do that is to be the most competitive, and likely one of the ways to do that is to have to be more technically competitive. So I think it takes people, I think it takes change. I think that we have initiatives that are doing that in this region more so than anywhere else, which is good. As an entrepreneur, like in your case as an early stage founder, like use Canada to be the early adopter jumping off point. But don't take that burden on. I don't think it would be a good idea for our founders to take the burden on of trying to shift this, because your job is to just build a massive global company, and there's some other people probably in this room whose job it is to shift this over.
Jay, I wanted to just thank you very much again for joining us. A round of applause for Jay.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for listening. Much appreciated.
Wonderful. Thank you again. Thank you all very much for joining us.